My future son-in-law's mother looked directly at me over candlelight and smiled politely while speaking Italian to her husband because she thought I couldn't understand a word. She said my daughter seemed sweet but painfully ordinary, the kind of woman men marry before realizing they wanted someone more sophisticated. I kept cutting my salmon like I hadn't heard anything. Then she laughed softly and said she hoped their future grandchildren inherited their father's culture because small-town American women rarely pass down anything interesting. My daughter was upstairs helping set dessert on the balcony. Her fiancé was outside bringing wine in from the patio. And for the first time in almost 5 years after my divorce, I felt something inside me stop shrinking. See, people make dangerous assumptions about quiet women over 60. They think silence means ignorance. They think politeness means weakness. What none of them knew was that before I became Eleanor Brooks from coastal Maine, before I spent 30 years married to a man who slowly convinced me my opinions were inconvenient, I had lived alone in Florence through my 20s. I had translated museum archives for extra money, argued politics in crowded cafes near Piazza Santo Spirito, and learned Italian from old women who corrected every mistake without mercy. I understood every single word at that table. And when his mother finally leaned closer and whispered in Italian that my daughter would probably spend her marriage trying to keep up with their family intellectually, I set down my wine glass, looked directly at her husband, and answered in flawless Italian, "You should be careful discussing someone's daughter in a language her mother speaks better than you." The entire table went silent so fast I could hear the ocean hitting the rocks below the restaurant terrace. His father's face lost all color. His mother blinked at me like she'd seen a ghost. And my daughter walked back onto the balcony just in time to realize something had happened that none of them were prepared for. If you're listening right now, tell me in the comments where you're from because I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you've ever had someone completely underestimate you, like the video and subscribe because what happened that weekend still feels unreal even to me. I used to think divorce only broke your marriage. I didn't realize it could quietly erase parts of your personality too. By the time I turned 62, I had become so careful about taking up space that I could walk into a room and leave without anyone remembering I'd been there. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and for almost 31 years I was married to a man who had a talent for making me feel slightly embarrassing without ever raising his voice. Richard never insulted me directly. Men like him rarely do. Instead, he specialized in tiny corrections delivered with a smile. He'd interrupt my stories to clarify details that didn't matter. He'd laugh gently when I mispronounced a word, even though he understood perfectly what I meant. At parties, he would explain my own opinions back to me as if I hadn't fully formed them myself. After enough years, you stop arguing. Then eventually you stop speaking before you've even opened your mouth. When he left me for a real estate agent 12 years younger than I was, the most frightening part wasn't losing the marriage. It was realizing how little of myself seemed to remain once he was gone. My daughter, Olivia, saw it before I did. She started calling more often after the divorce, sometimes pretending she needed recipes she already knew by heart just so I'd stay on the phone longer. Olivia had always been emotionally smarter than either of her parents. She worked as an architectural photographer in Boston and had recently gotten engaged to a man named Daniel Morty, whose family owned several upscale restaurants across the Northeast. Daniel was warm, patient, and impossible not to like. The first time I met him, he fixed my porch light without being asked and washed his own coffee mug before leaving. Any mother would have loved him instantly. Still, I worried about meeting his parents. Not because they were wealthy, although they were, but because Olivia kept describing his mother, Katerina, with the careful tone people use around difficult personalities. "She's very elegant," Olivia told me over the phone one night, "and very opinionated, but she means well. In my experience, people only add, but she means well when they're quietly preparing you for impact." 2 weeks later, Olivia invited me to a family engagement dinner at a cliffside restaurant outside Newport, Rhode Island. Daniel's parents were flying in from Connecticut that morning, and everyone would finally meet properly before wedding planning began. I almost said no. I stood in my bedroom for nearly an hour staring at dresses hanging in my closet and feeling ridiculous for caring so much. Somewhere along the line, I had developed the exhausting habit of assuming I would be the least impressive person in every room. In the end, I chose a navy silk blouse Olivia once said made my eyes look brighter, and drove 3 hours south along the coastline, trying to ignore the nervous ache sitting in my stomach. The restaurant overlooked the Atlantic from high stone cliffs, all candlelight and ocean wind and expensive people pretending not to notice how expensive everything was. Olivia waved the moment I walked in, her face lighting up in that immediate way that still made her look 10 years old for half a second. Daniel stood beside her with one hand resting lightly against her back. Then I saw his parents turning toward me from the table. Katerina Morty was striking in the way certain older European women are: silver jewelry, dark tailored clothes, posture so perfect it looked practiced. Beside her sat her husband, Matteo, quieter but observant, with the sharp eyes of someone who missed very little. Katerina smiled warmly as I approached, kissed both my cheeks, and said in polished English, "Eleanor, finally. We've heard so much about you." What she actually thought of me, however, I wouldn't discover until much later that evening when she made the mistake of assuming English was the only language I understood. Before I continue, I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever sat through a conversation where people smiled at your face while quietly judging you underneath it? If you have, leave a comment because I know I can't be the only one. And if this story is pulling you in, make sure you like the video because what happened next completely changed the atmosphere at that table. Dinner started pleasantly enough. The wine arrived first, then oysters, then soft jazz drifting through hidden speakers while waves crashed somewhere below the cliffs. Olivia sat glowing beside Daniel, excited and nervous in the way engaged women often are, constantly checking whether everyone was comfortable. I recognized the habit immediately. Women learn early how to manage the emotional weather around them. Katerina asked polite questions about my drive from Maine, my work before retirement, whether I enjoyed living alone now. Her tone was perfectly friendly, but something underneath it felt measured, as though she were quietly organizing me into categories. Matteo spoke less, though when he did, everyone listened. I noticed Daniel becoming subtly tense whenever his mother redirected the conversation. Not afraid exactly, more like a man anticipating turbulence before anyone else sees the clouds. Halfway through the main course, Olivia excused herself to take a call from her wedding planner. Daniel followed a minute later after the restaurant manager asked him something about a private event downstairs. That left me alone at the table with Katerina and Matteo for the first time all evening. The second Olivia disappeared, Katerina's posture changed almost invisibly. She leaned toward her husband and switched into Italian so naturally it was obvious she assumed privacy. "She's prettier than the mother," she murmured while cutting into her sea bass. Thank God Olivia inherited her father's features. Matteo gave a quiet hum of agreement. I kept sipping my wine. My pulse slowed instead of rising. Strange, the things age changes. 10 years earlier, those words might have shattered me for weeks. Now they simply revealed her. Katerina continued, speaking casually between bites. She wondered aloud whether Olivia understood how demanding life inside their family could become. "She seems sweet," she said, "but sweetness is not the same thing as depth." Matteo asked whether Daniel was truly serious about marrying an American girl with such a modest background. Katerina laughed softly. "Daniel likes rescuing people. He gets that from me." Something inside my chest went very still then. Not hurt, not embarrassment, recognition. I had spent decades shrinking myself around people exactly like this. People who mistook quietness for emptiness. Katerina lifted her wineglass and added one final sentence in Italian, the sentence that finally made me set down my fork. "At least the mother is too provincial to understand what we're saying." And before I tell you what I said next, I want you to do something for me. If you've ever spent years making yourself smaller just to keep peace around difficult people, leave a like on this video because I didn't realize how many of us were living that way until I finally stopped. And if you're still listening, subscribe, because sometimes the most important moment in your life starts with one sentence you almost didn't say. Katerina lifted her wineglass with that calm little smile still sitting on her face, completely certain I had understood nothing. I looked directly at Matteo first, not her. Then in perfectly clear Italian, I said, "You should be careful deciding how intelligent someone is based on how quiet they've chosen to become." The silence that followed felt physical. Matteo's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. Katerina blinked once, then twice, like her brain needed extra time to process what had just happened. At that exact moment, Olivia stepped back onto the terrace carrying her phone, smiling until she saw everyone frozen at the table. "What happened?" she asked. No one answered immediately. I kept my eyes on Katerina. "I understood everything," I said gently in Italian. "The comments about my daughter, about me, about Americans, all of it." Katerina's face lost color so quickly it startled even her husband. For a second she looked angry, then embarrassed, then something far less comfortable, ashamed. Daniel walked back onto the terrace carrying a bottle of wine and instantly sensed the tension. "Mom," he said carefully. Matteo finally cleared his throat. "Your future mother-in-law," he said slowly, "appears to speak Italian better than both of us." Daniel looked at me in complete shock. Olivia stared even harder. "Mom, since when do you speak Italian?" I almost laughed at that because the answer was complicated. since before marriage, before motherhood, before I started apologizing for existing too loudly in rooms where I had every right to stand. I lived in Florence for 6 years, I told her. I restored art archives for a museum near the Arno River before I came home. Olivia looked genuinely speechless. You never told me that. I know, I admitted quietly. Somewhere along the way, I got used to acting like the interesting parts of me belonged to another person. Katerina finally spoke then, this time in English. Mrs. Brooks, Eleanor, I owe you an apology. Her voice had changed completely. Gone was the polished superiority from earlier. What I said about your daughter was unfair. And ignorant. Olivia looked between us, confused and slightly horrified. Daniel set the wine bottle down harder than he intended. What exactly was said? He asked. Katerina closed her eyes briefly before answering honestly. Enough that your mother embarrassed herself tonight, Matteo said before she could soften it. Oddly, that was the moment I began respecting him. At least he didn't hide from truth once it arrived. The ocean wind moved through the terrace candles, making the flames bend sideways for a second. Katerina turned toward Olivia. You are not simple, she said firmly. And your mother is not provincial. I made assumptions because confidence sometimes disguises insecurity better than humility does. No one spoke after that for several seconds. Then Olivia did something that nearly broke my heart. She reached across the table, took my hand, and said very softly, Mom, who were you before Dad? I looked out toward the dark Atlantic for a moment before answering. Honestly, I think I'm still figuring that out. But for the first time in years, the answer didn't make me sad. Dinner changed after that, not magically, not perfectly, but honestly. Matteo started asking me about Florence. Daniel admitted he'd studied abroad in Milan for a summer and spoke terrible Italian. Olivia kept staring at me like she'd discovered a secret room inside her own childhood home. And Katerina listened more than she talked. Near the end of the night, while everyone else argued over dessert menus, she leaned closer to me and spoke quietly. You know, she said, women like us sometimes disappear so gradually we don't notice until someone finally sees us again. I thought about that the entire drive home along the dark Rhode Island coastline, about disappearing, about shrinking, about how easy it is to abandon parts of yourself just to make other people comfortable. My divorce hadn't erased me. Neither had age. Neither had marriage. I had done that slowly on my own, piece by piece, until one dinner table forced me to remember I was still there underneath all of it. The next morning, I woke up to 3 messages from Olivia asking me to teach her Italian before the wedding. One from Daniel apologizing for his mother, even though he didn't need to. And one from Katerina herself, containing the address of a tiny cafe in Florence she said I absolutely had to visit if I ever returned. I stared at that message for a long time before smiling to myself. Then I opened my laptop and renewed my passport. Because maybe life doesn't give you back the exact woman you used to be. Maybe it gives you someone older, steadier, harder to silence. And honestly, I think I like her better.